This morning is the second Sunday in a series we've called What's the Point?, which is a series through the stories Jesus told, called parables, from the Gospel of Luke. And this morning's is probably the best known story Jesus told. Lots of people, even people who've really never darkened the door of a church, are familiar with this particular tale. Let's jump in right away. Luke chapter 10, if you have a Bible with you. Luke 10, starting at verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "The Indianapolis Colts once drafted a wide receiver as a rookie, and he was very excited to play professional football and be drafted and play for the Colts. But his first practice did not go well. He messed up several routes that he was supposed to run, even though he had stayed up all night studying the playbook. He dropped several catchable passes that Andrew Luck had thrown to him. And one time he did catch a pass and ran, but then he got hit and he fumbled the football. And he walked dejectedly back into the showers after his first practice, wondering if he would even be able to stay on the team. And after his shower, he was getting dressed, and four offensive linemen, the biggest, strongest, meanest football players on the team, grabbed him and said, "Hey, rookie, we're going to teach you to hold on to that football." And so they took trainer's tape and they taped a football into his hands, and then they tied his hands and tied him up head to toe and bound him, put a gag in his mouth, and sat him in a chair in the locker room. And then they all laughed at him and said, "Remember this." And then they left and left him all alone. And he was so alone and so dejected and felt like such a failure. But then, who should come walking into the Indianapolis Colts locker room? The one and only, number 18, Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning comes in. He's just appearing at a benefit in town. He comes through. He sees this poor, hapless rookie bound and gagged on the floor of the locker room, checks his watch, and keeps on walking and goes right out. Oh, but then who should come walking through? Why? It's the quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts, Andrew Luck. He's just finished done talking to the media, you see, and so he's late getting ready. And so he comes walking through the locker room, and he sees this poor, hapless rookie bound and gagged on the floor. And he says, "I should have caught more of my passes, rookie." And he walks out. So who do you think's coming in next? It's not Tom Brady. That's too easy. Then the door should open, and who should walk in but Colin Kaepernick? I don't know why he's in Indianapolis today. He just is. But he comes in, and he sees this poor, hapless rookie bound and gagged on the floor, and he says, "Oh my goodness, what happened to you?" And he props the man up, and he takes out some scissors, he cuts the tape off, he gets the football out of the guy, gets the gag out of the guy's mouth, and he says, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And the guy says, yeah, I think so. He says, "What happened?" He said, "Well, they did this to me, and they tied me up because I screwed up on the practice field." And Colin says, "Oh, look, they wouldn't have done this to you if they thought you were going to get cut. They're just trying to teach you a lesson, all right? You just get back up, you get back out there, you're going to be better tomorrow. I know it." And he slaps the guy on the back. He says, "Hey, listen, do you have a girlfriend? You have a wife?" The guy says, yeah, I'm dating somebody." He says, "Well, here's $200. Why don't you just take $200, go out with your girl tonight, have a nice dinner, and just forget this ever happened. You'll be better tomorrow. And tell you what, here's my cell phone. Call me if you ever need any kind of encouragement, because I know what you're going through, because I've been there, kid." And then he walks out. How you like that story? It's not the way you wanted that to go, was it? Colin's not supposed to be the hero of the stories we tell in Indianapolis about football, is he? See, the parable of the Good Samaritan is probably Jesus' best known, but we don't hear it the way his first hearers heard it. This story lacks the power today it had when Jesus first told it, because we lack the cultural assumptions that made it so shocking to them. Here, in fact, is what Jesus actually said. In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave him to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. It's important to understand the context behind the story and why Jesus tells it in the first place. First thing we need to understand is that in God's economy, that is God's kingdom, who is my neighbor is not really the right question. In God's economy, who is my neighbor is not really the right question. Interesting thing here, why Luke says the man asks what he asks, the man's motive. It says on one occasion an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. He didn't stand up out of respect for Jesus or honest dialogue, truth-seeking dialogue with Jesus. He's feigning a kind of respect, but the question is designed to take Jesus down a notch or two, and that in public. He's an expert in the Jewish tradition. He knows the Old Testament alludes to the eternal inheritance one can possess. And so he asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What must I do to share in the resurrection of the righteous? When future blessing comes from God, how do I know I can receive that? And then Jesus, being a good Jewish rabbi, responds with a question of his own. He turns to the law and asks the lawyer what he sees it saying. And this guy says, Deuteronomy 6:5, portion of the law that a Jew would recite daily. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he also quotes Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. And these 2 commandments taken together was known as the Great Commandment. And Jesus says, yeah, that's right. Commends the answer and says, if you do this, you will live. Jesus isn't doing some works-based special dispensation here. He's asserting the ethical call of God, love God and to respond to other people in light of that love. Coming in context of Luke 10, what's going on here is Jesus' response means that those who really love God will be those who will hear Jesus, who will come to Jesus, who will respond to Jesus and receive life in Jesus. And as Jesus makes clear later, these people will not only get forgiveness from God, will get the Spirit of God from God. And that enables God's people to become different people with a new purpose, new hope, and new power. So love for God that comes to a person responding as a child of God, that means that the call of God will be heard. So Jesus rightly says, do this and you will live. If you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, one day you're going to be a follower of me. Luke tells us that the lawyer wants to justify himself, though. He doesn't judge Jesus' response as being adequate. And so he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Let's get specific. Who is my neighbor? And really, the lawyer's question is an attempt to create a distinction, arguing that some people are neighbors and others are not. And that my responsibility is only to love the people that are the people I like. And the suggestion that some people aren't neighbors, that's what Jesus is responding to when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus picks a Samaritan as the highlight of the story because this person is such a non-neighbor in the lawyer's mind. In God's economy, who is my neighbor is not the right question. And we see from the parable that Jesus tells, in God's economy, religiosity doesn't exempt me from being a neighbor. Being religious doesn't mean that I don't have to be a good neighbor. Interesting little cultural detail that Jesus picks, this treacherous road from Jerusalem to Jericho as the site of his story. It's a 17-mile journey. It was well known for being dangerous. The cultural equivalent today might be a trip through the inner city late at night. Thieves took advantage of caves that lined the road as it twisted through the desert, and they would jump travelers as they passed by. So this man who is passing through is stripped of his clothing, beaten and robbed, and left for dead, cast off on the side of the road. But help is on the way, right? 2 opportunities for help appear first a priest and then a Levite. Pious, righteous, religious people, though they may be, they pass by on the other side of the road and don't give the man any help in his hour of need. In each case, these righteous men happen down the path. The hero assumes, okay, help is on the way, here we go. In each case, there's disappointment. And I wonder why Jesus included that detail. If he wanted to just make a point about having compassion for people in need, he doesn't need to have the priest and the Levite go by. But he does include them. And he creates considerable suspense as first one and then a second individual pass by and don't do anything. And these are the people in the first century you'd expect these would be the first people to help. Paradoxical as it may sound, religion often gets in the way of showing God's compassion to people. Religion gets in the way of demonstrating God's compassion. These aren't any two passerby. They're representatives of the religious leadership of the day, more specifically the temple authorities. And because the man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and then because the priest is also described as going down the same road, we can't excuse their behavior by saying, oh, they're on their way to temple because they have these important religious duties to perform. No, they're coming from Jerusalem down to Jericho. They're on their way back from performing religious duties in the temple. They're just on their way home. The priest and the Levite would have been going home after their duties had been fulfilled. So why do they pass by? We aren't told. Perhaps they would fear being rendered ceremonially unclean from touching what they mistakenly think is a corpse. Could be. That would be an inconvenience for them to be rendered unclean. That could interfere with their religious duties down the line. But Jesus doesn't give them any motive. And so it's best not to speculate. Leave it to say that religiosity doesn't exempt me from being a neighbor in God's economy. How much of doing church, in fact, gets in the way of really doing the Lord's work in our world? If we get so busy with church matters that we never rub shoulders with unchurched people, that we never serve people in need in our world, then we've misunderstood our mission badly, the whole reason that we are a church. When their wedding venue fell through at the last minute this past year, Krista and Jeremy Barassa decided to hold their wedding ceremony at the groom's fire station in St. Paul Park, Minnesota, knowing that it was possible an alarm could disrupt things at any time. But they made it through their wedding ceremony without a hitch, but while they were taking photos before the reception, an urgent call came in for help to knock out a fire that was engulfing a house in a nearby town. Newlywed Krista told her new husband, go ahead, fight the fire. I've got the rest of my life with him, she told a TV station later. They needed him in that moment. 3 hours later, Jeremy returned to the reception and bride and groom had their first dance. That kind of thing just put the icing on the cake. I know she's the one for the rest of my life, he said. I love this story. This couple serves as a great reminder of the purpose of every local church. We're busy with church services, programs, activities, celebration. Great. God-honoring, yes. Important, yes. But we should be willing to be interrupted to carry out our mission to serve the world. The biblical equipping and the community part are so that we can be on mission everywhere. That takes precedence. After these two religious leaders pass by, along comes the Samaritan. And we learn the lesson that in God's economy, social and ethnic barriers don't exempt me from being a neighbor either. Religiosity doesn't exempt me from being a neighbor, neither do social and ethnic barriers. Samaritans in Jesus' day were despised people. A Samaritan was a descendant of unlawful intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles in Israel, sometimes centuries earlier. Samaritans were considered half-breeds racially, and theologically they were suspect too. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament as authoritative: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The rest of the Old Testament they didn't accept. So Samaritans knew nothing about King David or King Solomon or the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, at one point before Jesus came, they had once built their own temple on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. And you know what the Jews did? They went up there and tore that thing down. So there's a lot of bad blood between Jews and Samaritans in the first century. As far as the Jews were concerned, Samaritans were a bunch of half-breed heretics. But the Samaritan shows up in Jesus' story, and he has pity on the wounded traveler. And Jesus details a series of action verbs, how active this man is in ministering to this newly discovered needy neighbor. He goes to him. He bandages him. He pours oil and wine on his wounds for medicinal value in the first century. He puts him on his donkey, which means the Samaritan is walking on foot. He carries him to an inn. He takes care of him, even to the point of leaving enough money to make sure the man has 2 weeks lodging to recover. And then he tells the innkeeper, keep a running tab so that when I get back, I'll cover any cost overruns you may have encountered. That is kindness and love, compassion and mercy demonstrated. And then Jesus asks a simple question. Which of the three was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Interestingly, the lawyer doesn't say the Samaritan, because I don't think he can bring himself to say that word. Instead, he says the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. There are people all around us in our world and right here in south side of Indy who are in need of mercy. Physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. Do we share the Samaritan's compassion? The many needy people in our world, or have we become calloused and put up emotional force fields to shield us from that? Jesus is really honest in this parable about how expensive and costly compassion can be. I mean, people often talk sentimentally or idealistically about compassion, but getting close to people who are hurting almost always costs us something. Working with other people's wounds can get very messy. Investing in people in pain will take us off our normal schedule. Crossing over to help will inconvenience us. It'll cost us money or other precious resources. It may subject us to entanglements that go on for a long time. In other words, crossing over requires denying that very self that we've often protected and maintained. To do what the Good Samaritan did means we have to die to self a little bit, maybe a good bit. But to do what the Good Samaritan did means to walk the way of Jesus. Because Jesus came to where we were. He crossed over a great gulf from heaven to earth to become a fully human man. To live in poverty relative to any of us in this room. To be frustrated, to be harangued, vilified, arrested, beaten, tortured, and crucified. And he did that out of compassion. He did that to save us and to heal us. He gave his very life. Even 4-star generals can use some roadside help now and then. Former Secretary of State Colin Powell got some help from a military veteran this past week after he blew out a tire on his way to a doctor's appointment last Wednesday. Colin Powell said he was on his way to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland for an appointment when he got a flat tire on I-495, which is the beltway for Washington, D.C. Former Army general said he was having trouble changing the tire. It was cold outside and the lug bolts were very tight when a man with a prosthetic leg pulled over to help. Powell recounted the moment in a grateful Facebook post on Thursday. He said, as the man got out of his car, I could see he had an artificial leg. He said he recognized me and wanted to help me, and we chatted, and I learned that he lost his leg in Afghanistan when he worked over there as a civilian employee. He grabbed the lug wrench and finished the job as I put the tools away, and then we both hurriedly headed off to our appointments at Walter Reed. The man's name was Anthony Maggart, and he retired from the military in June of 2018 after 23 years serving in the Marines, Air Force, and Army. Maggart had already pulled over to the side of the road when he realized the person he was helping was Colin Powell. He said, he's got an iconic face, so I said to myself, hey, that's Colin Powell. He was kind of shocked, and he said, well, why are you helping me? I said, well, you can wait around for a two-legged guy, but right now you got a one-legged guy. Powell saw Maggart's small act of kindness as one that the whole country can learn from. He's posted, thanks, Anthony. You touched my soul and reminded me what this country is all about and why it's so great. Let's stop screaming at each other. Let's just take care of each other. You made my day. Maggart also posted about the encounter, posted some photos and said this, in the end, this lets you know we're all just people and sometimes you need help. I pulled over because I thought somebody needed help. I would have done that for anybody. Now, these two men could probably not be more dissimilar in so many ways. And I don't know if either of them has trusted Christ. But I know that their sentiment and their appreciation for what happened reflects the compassion of Christ and the Good Samaritan. And that's a way that this parable still resonates today. Centuries and centuries ago, compassion would have been ridiculed, looked down on, discouraged at every turn. Sign of weakness, waste of time. But not in God's economy. And we haven't yet hit on the most important point. We've seen that in God's economy, religiosity doesn't exempt me from compassion, from being a good neighbor. In God's economy, social and ethnic barriers don't exempt me from being a neighbor. But you see, many stories in Jesus' day were about two clerics and an ordinary Jew. That was a familiar setup, sort of like a joke where you have two examples as a foil to set up the punchline. You've heard jokes like that. There were an entire body of Jewish lore that had an anti-institutional, anti-clerical flavor to it. And so Jesus' audience no doubt thought he was setting them up for this kind of thing, where a priest comes by and he should have offered help, but he doesn't. Then a Levite comes by and he should have offered help, but he doesn't. And then an ordinary Jew, a simple farmer, or a day laborer. He'll be the hero of the story. But instead, huge shockwaves would have surged through Jesus' audience when they recognized the Samaritan was a hero. So we lose the impact of the story if we forget that good Samaritan was a complete oxymoron in that culture. Today we hear Samaritan and we think humanitarian. But they heard Samaritan and they thought the enemy. And that's the most dramatic point of the parable that Jesus is telling today. The lesson that the man in the ditch would have learned based on what happened is that in God's economy, even my enemy is my neighbor. In God's economy, even my enemy is my neighbor. By making the Samaritan the hero of his story, Jesus may be saying that one's enemy is the most important neighbor of all, especially if we want to become people who are significantly different from unredeemed people in the world. There are several different ways I could have contemporized this parable. Could have had a policeman see someone in distress and go by and not offer help. And then a fireman sees this person, goes by and doesn't offer help. And then an illegal immigrant stops by and offers help to this person in need. Or an evangelical pastor passes by and doesn't help. And then a Roman Catholic priest passes by and doesn't help. And then a Muslim imam stops and offers help to the person who is in need. So many ways to couch it. The more shocking, probably the more accurate. Even my enemy is my neighbor in the kingdom of God. So who is your enemy? Who is your enemy? And what does Christ call us to do for them? At one point, he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Were that we had more of that on Facebook and Instagram and social media. Love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Even your enemy is your neighbor. In Elmer Bendener's book, The Fall of the Fortresses, he describes one World War II bombing over the German city of Kassel. Our B-17, named the Tondaleo, was taking flak from Nazi anti-aircraft guns. And that wasn't unusual, but on this particular occasion, our gas tanks were hit. And later, as I reflected on the miracle of a 20-millimeter shell piercing the fuel tank without touching off an explosion, our pilot, Bon Fox, told me it wasn't quite that simple. On the morning after the raid, Bon Fox had gone down to ask the crew chief for the shell as a souvenir of the unbelievable luck. And the crew chief told him that not just one shell, but in fact 11 had been found in the gas tanks. 11 unexploded shells. Only one would have been sufficient to blast them out of the sky. It was as if the sea had parted before them. So awesome an event leaves me shaken Elmer writes, especially after I heard the rest of the story from Bond. He was told that the shells had been sent to the armorers to be diffused. The armorers told him that intelligence had picked them up. They couldn't say why at the time, but Bond eventually tracked it down, sought out the answer, and got it. Apparently, when the armorers opened each of those shells, they found no explosive charge. They were as clean as a whistle and just as dangerous. Were they empty? Not all of them. One contained a very carefully rolled piece of paper. On it was some handwriting in Czech. The intelligence people scoured the base for someone who knew how to read Czech, and eventually they found one who deciphered the note and translated the note read that had been wrapped up inside this shell. This is all we can do for you now. This is all we can do for you now. Even my enemy is my neighbor. The lawyer wants to know if he can be a neighbor to just a select elite few, just to the people he likes, just to the people who are like him. And Jesus tells him through the Samaritan's example, no, let the neighbor be you. Rather than worrying if someone else is my neighbor, trying to figure that out, Jesus' call is to be a neighbor to those in need. By reversing the perspective, Jesus changes both the question and the answer. He makes the call no longer one of assessing other people, but of being a certain kind of person. The point is this: who is my neighbor is a worldly question. Who needs me to be a neighbor is a kingdom question. Who is my neighbor? It's a worldly question. Who needs me to be a neighbor? That's a kingdom question. The call to be a responsive neighbor to those in need, basic element of discipleship, basic element of loving God and loving one's neighbor. So how can I be a neighbor? Well, it takes eyes and ears and a compassionate heart. That's the difference, if you think about it, between the priest, the Levite on the one hand and the Samaritan on the other. It's not what they see and hear. They all see and hear the same thing. It's what they do with what they see and hear. Only the Samaritan takes pity. Only the Samaritan has a heart. Neighbors see, feel, and serve. Every night, a group of Christ followers in London, England, don blue jackets and baseball caps, and they roam the streets. They call themselves street pastors. As they walk the streets in the middle of the night, they help to diffuse arguments and listen to people's problems and minister to the homeless, and help a drunk person get to the right bus or taxi. They hand out bottled water. The influence of these dedicated lay leaders is remarkable. London's metropolitan website states almost every London borough now has a street pastor's team. And the most immediate result in every case has been the drop in crime in areas where teams have been working. A former policeman told a newspaper his district would be much, much harder to police without the street pastors. Every street pastor begins his or her evening with prayer and meditation on Bible verses. They all acknowledge they have many people who are praying for them while they're out there on the streets. Communities respect their work, but the comment that the street pastors hear most often is, "You must be mad." But their good cheer is infectious. I got to meet one. Angie and I were in England last year, and we got to talk with Claire Burns. And she's a street pastor in Shrewsbury. This is happening in other communities besides London now. And she told me some about what they do. And almost everything they do is really kind of mundane and obvious. And they check in at corner shops just to say hello and how business is, talk about the weather. They pass a guy sleeping in a doorway. They go over, they check on what he needs, offer him an extra blanket. Afterwards, they can inform homelessness services. When a drunk man comes out of a pub, a couple of the team wander over to make sure he knows where he's going. And in Shrewsbury, it's believed that they have prevented suicides, people drowning in the river that runs by that town. The pastor of Shrewsbury Baptist Church, Charles Crossland, wrote that number of suicides in the river has declined since the street pastors began their ministry. I'm excited to tell you that Claire and a team of people from that church are going to be visiting with New Hope later this spring, bringing a team over to join with us for a week and worship with us and see what we do and fellowship together. An actual street pastor doing pretty low-level stuff, but it's actually the kind of low-level kindness that can be missing from any city, especially after dark. Who needs me to be a neighbor is a kingdom question. You know, a lot of times you hear that the task of dealing with pain in the world is so vast, we don't know where to begin, how can you even hope to make a dent in all the needs that are out there, all the pain, all the things that need to be done. And I understand that kind of thinking, but it can become an excuse for inaction if we let it. If I don't know where to begin, maybe I won't even start to help because I just feel so overwhelmed. But a better approach is to pitch in where I feel a sense and ability to help. Maybe I can't help everyone everywhere, but I can help someone somewhere. Try to make a difference. Being a neighbor doesn't require meeting every need that I'm aware of. Not every need constitutes a call. But being a neighbor means becoming one piece of God's puzzle and helping meaningfully in a specific context. Some people in our church serve as after-school tutors for kids in local schools. They're being a good neighbor. Other people in our church have felt called to serve as foster parents for days, weeks, months, while children are being placed for adoption. Others in our church give care community, give support to those foster parents. Some in our church, several men in our church, are active in ministry to the homeless, going out and being street pastors themselves here in Indianapolis. Neighborliness comes in all shapes and sizes. It's limited only by our failure to see, feel, and respond. So let me close with this question. Who needs you to be their neighbor? Who needs you? You, your situation, your resources, your awareness. Who needs you to be their neighbor this week? You know, you don't have to do it. No human law compels you to cross over the side of the road and help the person in the ditch. But if you do, if you choose to move toward the pain of others and not go around it, you'll walk in the way of Jesus. You'll walk in the way of Christ. Let me pray for us.